Was an Army infantry intelligence officer and then a CIA analyst for 30 years during the 1980s. He briefed top White House officials and the Secretary of State one-on-one with the President's daily brief. He was among the first to condemn the use of faulty intelligence to justify the war on Iraq. He's on the steering group of veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity. On February 15th of this year, he stood in silent protest with his back to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton during a public address about internet freedom. He was violently dragged away by security officers, bruised and jailed. And he's currently on a speaking tour to bring up the issue of the war on whistleblowers, in particular the issue of Bradley Manning. So Ray, let's talk about the conditions that Bradley Manning is under. I mentioned this letter that has been signed by about 250 law professors from around the country. It was published in major media. So the issue of Bradley Manning's treatment is gaining traction. Does it amount to, in your years of experience, does it amount to torture, what we're doing to him?
Of course it does. Cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. If you don't want to say torture, say those. There's a UN convention against that, and we're in direct violation of that. And to his credit, the old Professor Lawrence Tribe has spoken out. He referred to the Eighth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. The Eighth against cruel and inhuman punishment. The Fifth, the right to a speedy trial, the right to not be violated before convicted. I'll tell you a little. I had a dream last night. My dad is Professor Emeritus of Law at Fordham University, okay? And he's saying, Ray, this famous constitutional professor, Obama, could you find out which country's constitution he's an expert in? Because it can't be the U.S. Constitution, or else maybe he just doesn't know the Bill of Rights. So find out what country he's a specialist in. Now, my father had a great sense of humor, but, there it is, How can he pretend to be this? Now, Glenn Greenwald, to his great credit, has a nice wrap-up of this yesterday, but he was wrong about one thing. He said that this is highly embarrassing. A huge embarrassment is the way he put it to Obama. He forgets that Obama took that course at Yale Law School, which is called not to be embarrassed, just to be rhetorical, not to notice little people. See, my theology is that it depends on who you think God is and how God feels when little people are pushed around. Little people like Bradley Manning, little people like me before Hillary Clinton.
Right, and I want to talk about that a little bit later in our interview. Bradley Manning is only 23 years old.
That's right.
He's a very, very young man. How long has he been in detention, and has anybody been able to have contact with him? Does his family have access to him, etc.?
It's almost a year. He's estranged from his father. His father was given a podium on one of the one of the TV shows. He has a friend that comes and visits him from Massachusetts, from MIT, and he's got a lawyer. Otherwise, the government has violated its own ground rules, even Quantico ground rules, by disallowing a visit from Dennis Kucinich, for example, disallowing a visit from the UN rapporteur on torture.
Well, the UN rapporteur was complaining that he didn't get private access to Bradley Manning. So presumably he gets access in the presence of others, at which point, of course, Manning, would find it difficult to talk about his torture while his torturers are present.
Well, it could be used against him, anything he said. And, this reminds me of, remember the old minders that Saddam Hussein insisted would be with all the UN inspectors? There has to be somebody to watch and to intimidate a witness from saying what. But the point is that the UN rapporteur has been in 18 countries recently, all for unmonitored conversations. So, it's really a disdain for the law. It's I don't know what I guess there's a course at Yale Law School that removes your conscience, and gives you just rhetoric.
Well, on Monday, April 11th, just a couple of days ago, during the State Department's daily briefing, the acting Deputy Department spokesman Mark C. Toner was confronted by journalist Matthew Lee about Bradley Manning and the fact that the U.S. was not allowing the UN Special Rapporteur private access to Manning. I want to play a clip of the exchange between the reporter and Mark Toner, and the question followed from a discussion about China's human rights record.
Can you explain why, if the United States is proud of its human rights record, that the UN Special Rapporteur has complained that you're not allowing him independent access to Bradley Manning?
We've been in contact with the UN Special Rapporteur. We've had conversations with you in terms of access to. I'm sorry. we've had conversations with the Special Rapporteur. We've discussed Bradley Manning's case with him, but in terms of visits to PFC Manning, that's something for the Department of Defense.
And the ICRC with the same problem? The State Department is the direct contact with the ICRC, at least it was for the Guantanamo inmates. Have you had any contact with them?
I'm not aware. I don't know. I'd have to look into that. But, in terms of the UN Special Rapporteur, we've had conversations with him. We have ongoing conversations with him. But in terms of access to Manning, that's something for the Department of Defense.
What welcome scrutiny? Where's the harm?
I said we're having conversations with him. We're trying to work with him to meet his needs. But I don't understand the question.
Well, you said you welcome the scrutiny from outsiders
right.
of the United States human rights record, that you feel that it speaks to the strength of the U.S. system. So, why does it take very lengthy conversations to agree to let a UN Special Rapporteur have access to an inmate?
Well, again, for the specific visitation request, that's something the Department of Defense would best answer. But look, we've been very clear that there's a legal process underway. We've been forthright, I think, in talking about private PFC Manning's situation. We are in conversations, ongoing conversations with the Special Rapporteur. We have nothing to hide. But in terms of an actual visit to Manning, that's something that DoD would handle.
Well, but you have conveyed messages from DoD back to the UN on this?
No. We're aware of his requests. We're working with him.
You said you've been forthright in your discussions of his treatment? It seems to me that the only person who was forthright in discussions of his treatment resigned several days after making those comments. Can you explain what you mean by you've been forthright in terms of his treatment?
He is being held in legal detention. There's a legal process underway, so I'm not going to discuss in any more detail than beyond what I've just said, because there's a legal process underway.
So that's what you mean by forthright.
I can't discuss his
being
treatment.
Forthright is saying nothing because there's a legal process underway. Is that correct?
That's not correct at all. And we continue to talk to the Special Rapporteur about his case.
Well, okay. So if you've been what do you talk to him about? He says, I'd like to visit him, and I need to do it privately, and you say no.
I'm not going to talk about the substance of those conversations. I just say
Well, then I don't understand how you can say that you're being forthright about it if you refuse to talk about it. And if you don't talk about it, at least forget about what the actual conditions of his treatment are. But if you're not prepared to talk about your conversations with the Special Rapporteur, that's being even less than not being forthright, because you're not telling us what you told him.
But you understand the legal constraints that I'm operating under, because this is an ongoing legal process. He is being held.
I understand that you're put in a difficult position where you say that you're willing, as Arshad noted, that you don't understand why China is so upset, because the U.S. is willing to open up its human rights situation to all kinds of scrutiny. And then the first example that anyone raises.
And Matt, I would raise with you the fact that much of China's report came from open source, which is what an independent media does, and would note that that kind of independent media does serve a function, and there are details about Manning case and other human rights concerns out there, but I'm not going to talk about it here.
And that is a lengthy exchange between Mark C. Toner, who is the acting deputy department spokesperson for the State Department, and journalist Matthew Lee. That last bit of exchange was quite interesting. I want to just remind our listeners that my guest in studio is Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst. He is in town for a number of speaking events that we'll tell you about in just a moment. Ray, what do you make of this interesting exchange between these two, remembering that P.J. Crowley, the State Department spokesperson, just a month ago resigned after he actually was forthright about the conditions of Bradley Manning?
Well, it's shameful. I'm ashamed to be an American represented by a second stringer like that spokesman. Hats off, by the way, to Matthew Lee.
Right.
Wow, there's one...
A real journalist.
Yeah. It's shocking that
you didn't let him off the hook.
No. But, what strikes me about all this is the DOD, the Pentagon, the Defense Department says, even the president, you may note, said the Department of Defense, assured me that, well, who's running this country? Who's running this Constitution? The Pentagon says this is okay, and the president says, well, I'm sure it's okay. The spokesman for the State Department says, well, we talked to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon says, well, give me a break. Who's running this country? And the answer is let me just quote Cornel West on Sunday on TV saying that in his view, Obama has become a mascot for Wall Street, and I would add the Pentagon and other places. He's a spokesman, he's a terrific orator, but he has no backbone, and he has no feel for the Constitution, which he professes to teach.
So let's talk a little bit more about the response now to what's happened to Bradley Manning. The country was completely focused on the WikiLeaks scandal when it first broke last year. Julian Assange became a hero for progressives, and then slowly there started becoming this. There was this increasing awareness that rather than Julian Assange was perhaps the person who's being held responsible for leaking these documents. He's the alleged source of the documents to WikiLeaks, Bradley Manning. Whether he did it or not, he's being held responsible for it. And there has been now a growing movement to try to raise awareness of the conditions that this young man is being held under. Tell us about the efforts that you've undertaken, particularly with this speaking tour that you're on. It's called U.S. Tour of Duty, Operation Full Disclosure. What's that all about?
Well, I'm very fortunate to be teamed up with two wonderful folks. Mike Needham, whose son John was a casualty of the wars we're waging, and Susan Rosenberg, who was a political prisoner in a U.S. jail for 16 years out of a 58-year prison term and freed by Bill Clinton on his last day in office. We're talking mostly about torture and what that means, what it means to have been experimented upon in a U.S. federal penitentiary, and what it means for a U.S. soldier who objected to the violence being done in Afghanistan against civilians, what happened to him by the leaders of his own unit. But in answer to your question more generally, who's the hero here with respect to exposing the indignities visited upon Bradley Manning? His name is Daniel Ellsberg. There is a guy with integrity,
right.
Okay? He and I and others have been trying to persuade people to come out with secret material so that they could expose the lies upon which these wars were based, and Bradley Manning did it. And the first one up to defend him
he's suspected to have done it. We should
okay, all right, we always have to say subjunctive here. but Dan Ellsberg did that, and
of course he's known for the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and so that's a really important point. We all need to stand up because Bradley Manning has done something that Dan and I and others have appealed to, and it's something I would note that I didn't have the guts to do. Now, Bradley Manning, as you pointed out, was 22. Let me tell you a very brief story about how I blew it when I was 28, okay? I was working on Vietnam from the Soviet perspective, but I was very, very clearly in touch with the Vietnam analysts. Sam Adams, good friend of mine, was the analyst on Vietnam. He found out that there were about 600,000 communist fighters under arms, okay? General Westmoreland in Vietnam would not permit the total count of enemy to go over 299,000. Suspicious? 200. So half, okay? Now, I said to Sam, how do you explain the unwillingness of the commander of our forces to accept the real number of enemy? He says, well, we've been killing so many VC and so many, the press in Saigon is not real good, but they can do arithmetic and it just wouldn't parse. Then he said, there's a cable in, Ray. It's dated August 20, 1967, and it's from Westmoreland's deputy. And you know what it says? It says, we can't possibly accept Sam Adams' real numbers because, quote, we have been projecting an image of success, and there is no way we could prevent the media from coming to a gloomy and unwarranted conclusion, end quote. Okay, now I could have asked Sam Adams, and I thought of it, give me a copy of that cable. I want to take that down to the New York Times Bureau in Washington. People have to realize New York Times was an independent newspaper at the time, okay? They might have published that. This was 1967. If that worked, if the U.S. people got information on what the lies and deceit were from Saigon, those of you who know what the Vietnam Memorial looks like in Washington, that whole left wing wouldn't be there. You know why? Because there'd be no names to chisel into that granite. So I live with that. Now, Bradley Manning, 6 years junior to me, had the guts to do that. I didn't. And so that's why I feel a special obligation to say, look, this guy did the right thing. Yeah, he signed a little promise not to release classified information, but that was on the premise that classified information would endanger national security, not political embarrassment. So that's one reason why I'm out in the forefront of with Dan to support Bradley.
And Ray McGovern, you're going to be speaking this afternoon at 3 o'clock for our Santa Barbara listeners. You'll be at UC Santa Barbara at the Multicultural Center Theater, 552 University Road. It is a free event, and also tonight from 7 to 9 p.m. you'll be in Camarillo at the UFCW Orchid Room at 7 p.m. That's 816 Camarillo Springs Road. And then tomorrow you will be in San Diego at the San Diego City College from 1 to 3 p.m. in the Faculty Lounge at 1313 Park Boulevard. All events are listed at ustourofduty.org. We'll also post them to our website, uprisingradio.org, later today. I want to talk about what happened to you on February 15th of this year. Before I play for our listeners this clip, tiny sound clip of Hillary Clinton speaking, and you yelling as you're dragged away. This is radio, so we can't show our listeners the visuals, but it's on YouTube. Explain to us what Hillary Clinton was talking about and what your goal was as you were, what was your intention? You stood there with your back to her in a silent protest, right?
Yes. As she walked in, she was greeted by effusive applause, effusive in the real sense of that term. And I found myself joining in, And then I thought, this woman is at least partly responsible for untold misery, destruction, death, and wounding in this world.
And she was talking about internet freedom?
And she was talking about the right to dissent, And so I said, this is too much. You're a real phony here. So I took off my outer shirt. I had my Veterans for Peace shirt on, and I simply turned around about 12 yards in front of her, right front and center, and I faced the back. And I'm looking at one point in the back, and I'm saying, hey, 2 minutes go by. This is going to work. I can stand for 40 minutes. She can't get the idea that everybody in this place thinks that she's the cat's pajamas. And then all of a sudden, guy comes from behind me, blindsides me, grabs me, great big guy with looked like a Redskins reject, comes in. They pick me up and they drag. Intelligence analysts aren't supposed to admit that they're shocked about anything. This
You were
is
shocked,
a big shock. So much so that I forgot, page 43, 44 of the Code Pink Manual, which says as soon as they grab you, you shout out.
Right.
You say, so it took me until I was almost out there before I thought to say, well, so this is America.
Right. Well, let's play a clip of that. This is the sound of Ray McGovern, February 15th of this year, while he was being violently dragged away by security officers in the middle of a speech given by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
Satellite signals were jammed and internet access was blocked for nearly the entire population.
So this is America.
The government
This
did
is
not
America.
want the
Who are
people
you?
to communicate with each other, and it did not want the press to communicate with the public.
And that is the sound of Ray McGovern protesting as he's being dragged out. What was really interesting to me, Ray, was that she didn't skip a beat.
She didn't miss a syllable, yeah.
I mean, she must have noticed you and known what was happening.
Well, she could not have not noticed it. If you watch her, she's very focused on the right hand, and then I'm just a little bit off to the left center, and then she turns to the hard left center there. And, I see it as a metaphor There must be a course at Yale Law School that enables you to be deliberately unaware of the pain that you inflict or the pain that is occasioned by your policies or by your presence. I mean, small potatoes for me. But for all those people in Iraq, which he was a big supporter of, all those people in Afghanistan, and now elsewhere, Palestine, you know, it was a small price for me to pay just to demonstrate that, you know, not everybody agrees with your policies, and I'm willing to just stand up to demonstrate. I thought it was the most nonviolent way to do that.
Right.
But,
you didn't even unfurl a banner or wear a bright pink shirt.
Well, you know, let me just interrupt because the only mainstream media, so-called, to say anything about this, even though there were 18 TV cameras there, was Fox News.
Wow. Headline:
Heckler disrupts Secretary Clinton's speech. Text: it was not known exactly what he was going to do, this elderly man. It was awful. But it was thought he might have a sign or that he might shout out, and so he was preemptively ushered out.
Ushered out, yeah. Ushered
Yeah.
out pretty violently, and I saw the photos of your bruises afterwards. You know, Hillary Clinton has played a big role in the war on Libya that we're now fighting. So I want to transition to that subject in the last few minutes of our interview. You know, this is a really interesting issue that has split progressives, it seems, or at least there's at least one faction of progressives that are people who call themselves liberal who support the Libyan war, and you know, there may be widespread agreement on the legitimacy of the Libyan opposition to want a dictator like Muammar Gaddafi out. But where do you stand on this? Do you join the Juan Coles, or do you join, you know, the rest of the progressives who are quite upset about this war?
Well, first off, as an intelligence analyst, you know, I think it's a real fool's errand. I mean, General Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, had the guts to tell Congress, look, Gaddafi has the forces. He's going to prevail, okay?
Wow.
Now, he caught all kinds of heat for that, and, you know, there's some question as to whether he should have said that in public, but that's the situation. So this business where you get Air Force guys flying in there and win the war, give me a break. That worked real great in Vietnam. Then it's working really great in Afghanistan. So from a professional intelligence point of view, who are these guys? Who are these rebels? We don't even know who they are. Now we got some, well, not boots on the ground, we have some sneakers on the ground, CIA guys, right? And we're trying to find out who these guys are. So that's from the intelligence point of view. From, you know, I don't consider myself a liberal conservative. I like to consider myself a constitutional person, okay? Now, for me, it's enough to say this was a bald violation of the Constitution of the United States. Our founders, who came out of a tradition where kings would march people off to the war, reserved the right to declare or otherwise authorize war to the people of the United States through their representatives. That's Article 1 in the Constitution, and it's not a coincidence that it's Article 1. These so-called Article 2 powers that have been contrived for the president simply by interpreting his position as commander-in-chief of the U.S. forces, those powers do not enable a president to start a war. And to their credit, some of the people in Congress are saying, hey, wait a second, you know, this has gone too far. You can't commit U.S. forces to a war without adequate consultation unless there's an imminent threat. Now, the imminent threat was hardly to the United States, wasn't it? Just like the imminent threat from Iraq was hardly to the United States. And yet, the Constitution has been completely dissed, has been completely just not abided by. And that's the most important thing, and that's where I come out.
Well, some might argue that the most important thing was that we have apparently prevented a massacre, and that's arguable. Some in Libya are quite certain that if it weren't for the NATO forces, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, if it weren't for the NATO forces, we would have seen tens of thousands of Libyans killed by now. And, you know, certainly there have already been thousands killed before we came in. And the fact that the NATO presence has prevented that means that even their presence, even their airstrikes show that it's a success, that we've gone in there for humanitarian reasons.
Yeah, that's based on the premise that Gaddafi is crazy, just like Saddam Hussein was crazy, okay? These people...
But he is slightly crazy.
Well, he's a little, yeah. But, you know, you can scare the hell out of a crazy person, and those efforts were not tried. There was no real attempt to give him some way to compromise on this thing or some way out. Okay, it was all a business of going in there in force And of course, you know, you have to admit that you have to acknowledge that Libya has oil in it, and that makes a big difference. And it's not only oil, it's the refined kind of oil that can easily be used without further work in Western Europe, and that's why you have France and Britain and the others all in there. So it's a very it's kind of a hypocritical sort of thing to say there was no other way to do this, and you don't do it with an air force. You can recruit other people to do this to save those civilians. Now, it's not cut and dry that they might have been massacred, but you know the proof is in the pudding. And for Gaddafi to say that, and then for us to pounce and say, "Aha! He's going to massacre these people unless we send in our forces," that's a little dubious. Witness the history of the last decade.
Finally, Ray McGovern, we are up on Tax Day very, very soon, and the tradition of tax resistance has been a long one around the war issue, has been a long one in this country. And with the budget discussions underway, much is being made of the Pentagon's budget being slashed. Yet a ridiculous portion of our taxes go toward defense spending. What are your thoughts on the chunk of money that the Defense Department sucks up every year, and their assertion, and Obama's assertion, that this year we're cutting lots and lots of money out of the Defense Department's budget?
Well, that's bogus. We're not, okay? What really strikes me as bizarre, and this, I guess, is partly due to the mainstream media avoiding it, is that if you take what the economists call opportunity costs, okay? Well, what does that mean? That means for every $2 billion a week that we put into Afghanistan, what would that mean for the economies of Illinois, Indiana, or Ohio?
California. Right?
Oh, California, okay? So people need to be aware that, you know, for one tank, you could rescue a whole school district. From one fighter bomber, you could rescue a whole state. And those things are not made clear. Once the American people do become clear on that, then I think they'll insist that this outrageous expenditure of money on forces and equipment for non-existent enemies we have to sort of invent. You know, who are these fancy fighters going to fight against? The Soviet Union? No, that imploded. China? Well, maybe, you know, China spends one-sixth amount of money on their military as we do. So, yeah, it's time that people got the word, and I have basic faith in the decency of the American people to say, look, it's more important to keep hiring teachers than it is to build fancy new planes.
Ray McGovern, it's always a pleasure to have you here. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sonali.